Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, so when I was there, I spent a lot of time doing research and working with the women's movement, learning about the women's structures and stuff. So I have a particular, for anyone who's on this call who's interested in that part of the movement, I have a particular love for, interest, and knowledge about that part of the movement, and I'm happy to engage with anyone about it. So my role tonight is just to orient us into the sort of seismic changes that have happened in Syria in the past few months, and to sort of give us a rundown, remind us of all the sort of different perspectives that we've gone through in the past few months. So contextually, in November, what was the situation in Syria was that it was a little bit of a stalemate. The borders of who was in control of what territory had been the same, more or less, for some years. The people who are now in control of Damascus controlled a very small territory in Idlib, in the northwest. But starting on November 27th, they sort of launched a surprise attack, which surprised many, many people all over Syria, certainly, and definitely the world. And they first took control of Aleppo, which at the very beginning, just to remind us of where we were mentally at that time, it seemed like that was going to be where they stopped. But then the resistance was so little from the Syrian regime. The resistance was nothing from Russia, who had heretofore been supporting the Syrian regime, but was very drained and, of course, distracted by their war in Ukraine. And so then they continued their lightning offensive over the next 2 weeks and sort of swept across Western Syria, downward into Hama and Homs. And by the time they took those two cities, it started to feel very real that they were going to take Damascus, and the Syrian regime, which had been, 50 years oppressing the Syrian people, would maybe finally fall. And then on December 8th, that's exactly what happened. They entered Damascus and took over, and Bashar al-Assad popped up a few days later in Moscow. So, or somewhere in Russia. We don't know. So that was undoubtedly a moment of joy and relief for Syrians across the board. The sort of reflection on what had happened and who had taken control and everything would happen later, but there was Syrians started pouring in from all parts of Europe where they had been seeking refuge, from Turkey. People were celebrating. The world watched as the jails that had been, sites of extreme torture at the hands of the Syrian regime were liberated. And so there was absolutely joy at this liberation. And people were very happy. Of course, though, the people that took over, and the man that took over, Noam Deguer al-Jolani, name that he now goes by is his name, Shura, has a storied history in Islamist political groups. And so it was sort of an open question of how the group that is now in control of Damascus, who had been in control of this smaller part of Syria in Idlib, would approach governing the whole of the country. When they were in Idlib, the approach was, it's a more conservative part of the country. They certainly played that up in their governance. The approach was very much to rule with Islamist bent. And so there was this question of what is that going to look like for wider Syria, which of course is a very pluralistic country. There are many different ethnic groups. There are people of all different persuasions. It's a very large secular population. So these are the questions that the sort of world had, and certainly Syrians had. But people were cautiously optimistic and joyful. So then he started branding himself more differently and moderately. The pictures that we saw of him were, in Western suits, very different from the military fatigues and keffiyehs that he had been in for many, up until that point. His first overseas trip was to Saudi Arabia, which was interesting because it sent a message potentially to Turkey, who had been a backer of his. His group, HTS, not as close to Turkey, exactly as groups like the Syrian National Army that are operating in the Northeast, and more topical for our conversation on Rojava, but certainly had a lot of support from Turkey. And so him going to Saudi Arabia as his first foreign trip was a very interesting moment in the progression of what this diplomacy looked like, because he was sort of sending a wider Arab, like pan-Arab, a message. His foreign minister, Hassan al-Shibani, was interviewed by Tony Blair at Davos, which, was a very interesting moment when he was asked, what their vision for Syria is. He said that they take inspiration from Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland, painting this very interesting vision for what they were trying to, like tech Islamic tech decentralization can't it was a very interesting answer, and so that opened up even more questions of what their approach to governance would be. At the same time, of course, as all this is happening in Damascus, and as the world is watching closely what's happening with Shura and his governance strategy, the Turkish-backed SNA takes the opportunity to begin their attacks against Northeast Syria. And I will let Arthur get into more of what that looked like at the time, but that is ongoing. Those attacks are ongoing. Hopefully, after the announcement that we saw yesterday, they will slow down or maybe even cease. You always have to have hope in that regard. So I'll let Arthur talk about that. But just to continue about what was happening in Damascus, we saw Barbara Leaf, who from the US side is the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, go and visit Damascus, meet with Jolani. They did not do a press conference. There was an interesting sort of, these diplomatic moments where she had traffic, so she had to, she couldn't make it to the press conference, and these sorts of questions. And so the US was very immediately talking with him. At the time, there was a $10 million bounty on his head, or for information for him, because he was on the US terrorist list. The bounty was lifted. Whether or not HTS is still a terrorist group is in limbo. It hasn't been officially removed yet, but nonetheless, the US was talking directly to him very immediately. Of course, the US is in Northeast Syria. They are the partners on the ground with the autonomous administration, with the SDF. Notably not with the autonomous administration. It's not a political alliance, it's a military alliance. So don't let me confuse anyone by that slight mistake. And so of course, the US is here, and there's this question of how much they're trying to broker this situation, what their role is. I mean, it certainly seems like it's been quite extensive in terms of pushing for and supporting the negotiations towards this deal that we saw yesterday. At the same time, the Germans were sending delegations. Europe was wanting to, normalize. Europe, of course, has many Syrian refugees. It's put something of a stress on their system, and there was a sort of rush to normalize, but cautiously. So the EU lifted lifted sanctions, including civil aviation, so allowing people to, like fly into Syria, maybe go home, check out if they want to go home, humanitarian banking so that people can transfer funds back to their families in Syria, to facilitate, getting back on their feet and all these things. So there's cautiously optimistic, but reversible sanctions being lifted in the EU. And the US did a similar thing under General License 24. They issued in order to allow similar humanitarian flows to come into Syria, to sort of ease this transition, give people a reprieve. The autonomous administration, of course, starting in 2021, already has a sanctions reprieve, a waiver, essentially, for all the sanctions that were on Syria for mostly everything except for oil and other key industries under General License 22 is what it's called in the US system. And so that already exists in Northeast Syria. The extent to, so this conversation now about when will sanctions, because now there's an active ongoing conversation about when will sanctions be lifted from Syria. Will they be lifted from Syria? What does Shira need to show in terms of what his governance will look like in order for the EU to go all the way, for the US to go all the way? That had already happened in the Northeast, but of course, with the sanctions on Syria as a whole, they're prevented from benefiting from that to the extent that they might, because there's over-compliance, certainly in banking systems, in any sort of economic activity with anything having to do with Syria, and of course, without stability, without the Turkey stopping their attacks, and without stability in the country as a whole, investors and anybody who would want to do economic activity in the region are wary. So it's certainly, even though sanctions are technically lifted on the Northeast, it's definitely a problem that affects them as well, and is a pan-Syrian problem. Okay, so there's then in the South, there's a majority Druze region, which borders Lebanon, I believe, but not directly Israel. And they announced their own. So that's what was happening. But at the same time, there were, there were also some signs that Shira's governance system and the people that he was putting into key positions of power were much more Islamist than a lot of the more secular parts of the population, and certainly the minorities, non-Muslim minorities were comfortable with. And so there started to be some anxiety amongst Christian populations, certainly among the Alawites, amongst the Druze in the South. And so in this milieu, the Druze announced the Suwaida Military Council in the South. They were explicit that they weren't separatist. They just wanted to protect themselves and establish protection for themselves until it was clear that there was going to be a inclusive governance structure for Syria with constitutional rights for all minorities going forward. This is really similar to what the autonomous administration and SDF's position has been since they took power, and since HTS took power in Damascus. They've been explicit that they're not separatist. They're not looking for a non-unified Syria. They are looking for strong local governance, a federal system, but they're absolutely not separatists. The Druze are saying the same thing. And so it looked there, and then the Alawites, which I will get to in a minute, have been experiencing violence as the ethnic group that is connected, considered connected to the former regime. Bashar al-Assad, the former dictator, was an Alawite. They have been experiencing violence since the fall of the regime, and so they were also organizing themselves in order for protection. So there looked for a moment like there was this sort of coalition of minorities, we can say, that was sort of forming along the model of this federal system that the autonomous administration has been building in the Northeast, because of course in the Northeast there is an existing system of multiple ethnic groups working together: Christians, Kurds, Arabs, in their system. And the Syrian Democratic Council, which is the coalition of political parties, individuals, tribal representatives who believe in this model of the autonomous administration as a model for the rest of Syria, for the future of Syria, also includes people from all over Syria, not from the Northeast, not only from the Northeast. So for example, the Syrian Democratic Council representation in Washington, D.C. Is a Syriac Christian man, a Kurdish woman, and an Alawite man from Latakia. So those relationships have existed. They've been existing throughout the project of the autonomous administration. These relationships are being built. The SDC has sent many delegations to Swaida, to Druze territory. And so these relationships were existing. And there was this question of how this would maybe flower. But the problem has always been amongst these groups one of geography. So the Kurdish majority region, even though it's very diverse in the Northeast, it's not only Kurdish majority, it's not only Kurdish people in the Northeast, is separated from both the Alawites and from the Druze populations by large swaths of desert, and then also by large, huge populated cities. And so that was always a question. So I will also say that there was existing. So before now, in the past maybe 2 months, there's been a misunderstanding about the autonomous administration internally in Syria. I say with humility, but about the autonomous administration and what its political goals have been. There's a lot of understanding of it as a separatist project that was seeking the dissolution of Syria and seeking to separate from Syria. That is not what they were seeking fundamentally, and the SDC and the SDF and the autonomous administration have been very clear about that for many years. But there's a strong narrative about Kurdish separatism that was playing a part, certainly in the inner Syrian dialogues about what will happen now. Because there was a big open question about whether or not the SDF will be able to come to a deal with HTS and how those negotiations were going, because they started almost immediately. And that question is still open, but it has slightly been answered yesterday when we saw this deal that the SDF and so General Mazloum Kobani and al-Shura have made to integrate the SDF into the Syrian armed forces as well as the civil institutions. So I think the best way I've heard that explained is it's a deal essentially to make a deal. So there's a lot of open questions about what this is going to actually look like on the ground, and what structures the autonomous administration they're going to be able to preserve, what they won't be able to preserve, how it's going to shift and change. But one thing I would point out is that HTS, in terms of loyalist fighters that they have in their ranks, it's hard to know exactly how many, but I'll put a conservative estimate at 5,000. The SDF, I'll put a conservative estimate at 80 to 100,000. So when we talk about the merging of these forces, I'll just put that out there as something to think about. Like, what is that actually going to look like on the ground in terms of who's going to be able to have power? One thing I will just say to wrap up is that in terms of what's happening now and what we saw this past weekend and has been happening to the Alawite community on the coast, there's a lot of different and conflicting information about whether it's pro-Assad forces clashing with HTS or this. But I can say from my perspective, from what I'm hearing, both from the Alawite representation here in the United States and from people on the ground that I've talked to, is that there is really a what amounts to an ethnic cleansing going on, and that's how it's being experienced by the people. And it is absolutely something that the international community should be paying attention to and naming. And a lot of the media reporting has been not very clear in this way. And unfortunately, it was starting to get much more attention this weekend, but then it's been sort of usurped by this news about the SDF HTS deal. And so just to keep our attention on what's happening on the coast. So hopefully, like, the lessening of pressures on tension all across Syria can lead to, and this is what representatives of the SDC and the SDF have been saying, can lead to a lessening of pressure, which stops this violence. And that is very necessary. I'll also say in the agreement, there was nothing specifically about women. And as we know, one of the amazing innovations of the Northeast and everything that's happened there, and also of the SDF, itself is the YPJ and the women's forces. And so it remains an open question, right? Like how much that will be a part of the negotiations going forward. The YPJ is not under male commandership. That doesn't mean that they can't be, reach a deal. They haven't made a comment about it publicly, but that is a tenet of what has happened and women's liberation in the Northeast and how that was made possible. And so that's something that has not been made part of the conversation very much in the in the media. And so it's just something I wanted to highlight because as people who are looking from and trying to learn from what happened in Northeast Syria, women's autonomy in a real way, both in the military forces and in the civilian administrations, is a big part of what allowed such amazing social transformations to take place. And so something I would offer for us to think about. Okay. Thank you very much. And I turn it over to Arthur.
Yeah, thanks, Clara. I think I don't want to speak for you, but it's easy to feel overwhelmed in this moment by like the scale of what's happening, how quickly things are changing, and also the need to understand context in order to like feel oriented in a way that allows us to understand what's happening because it's just so complicated what's going on in Syria because like you said, Syria is such a diverse place. There's been over a decade of civil war, so you have all kinds of different political and cultural conflicts and distinct communities. And then you have the interests of governments, powerful states outside of Syria, all of which have sort of like a stake in influencing what happens there. So I myself am still trying to wrap my head around, what's going on. And so just to like echo the word humility that you threw out there, that feels very important. So I think I'll take a stab at just kind of like adding to what you laid out and then we'll move into questions and I'm sure like we'll get into the good stuff when we start hearing from other folks here. But one bit of context just to add to the recent months since HTS launched its offensive, which ultimately led to the overthrow of the Assad regime, is just to mention that Rojava, or larger than what's considered Rojava, even, right? Like the territory of the autonomous administration, lost real land in cities and entire communities were displaced in those early weeks of violence, right? So as HTS launched this sort of lightning offensive that ultimately overthrew Assad in the capital, Turkey and Turkish proxies, the SNA, really stepped into the chaos, into the vacuum to take advantage of it as best they could. And the first thing that they did in that context was to invade Sheba canton. And Sheba is a region north of the city of Aleppo. It's in the far kind of northwest of Syria. And this is a place where thousands and thousands of primarily Kurdish people from Afrin who were displaced from the canton of Afrin, which was invaded by Turkey in 2018 and occupied since then, were displaced to Sheba. And then so just this past December, yet again, the people of Sheba were displaced outside, like far from their homeland, rather than being in Sheba right next to Afrin. They've now been forced to move to other areas much further east, like on the east of the Euphrates River, just for safety and shelter. I spent a lot of time in Sheba Canton, and I can tell you that the people from Afrin are like some of the most incredible people I met in all my time in Syria, in Rojava, and really like are in so many ways the heart and soul of the Rojava revolution. A lot of these families and communities have been a part of the Kurdish freedom movement for a long time and are really just everyday people, are like steeped in these ideas of women's autonomy, of direct democracy. And so in all the ways that it's inspiring, it was also incredibly heartbreaking to see what I think we can say probably a minimum of 100 to 150,000 people being displaced from those regions. And of course, some of them were just outright killed by the SNA. There were convoys of civilians who were just evacuating the region that were periodically attacked by the SNA. And then the city of Menbij, which is along the Euphrates River, was also eventually seized by the Turkish-backed SNA with, of course, with the help of Turkish air power. So these are gains, you could say, that Turkey's proxy forces made in those chaotic early weeks of the HTS offensive. So the front line of Rojava, the territory that really the SDF defends and the SDC governs, has at this point moved to the Euphrates River as a kind of that's the new front line. It has been for a number of weeks, and that the Tishreen Dam has been kind of this flashpoint of fighting between the SDF and the SNA, and the dam remains in control of the SDF. But those are major changes to understand. But something I wanted to kind of bring up is I think there's so many things happening so rapidly, and there's so many details to what's happening on the ground. I think it can be more confusing than necessary to trying to understand what's going on without not only historical context, but kind of a grounding in what the goal and vision of the Kurdish freedom movement is in the first place, right? So, Clara mentioned how some folks misunderstand the Kurdish freedom movement's goals and ambitions as being sort of separatist. And I think on the other side of that, I think it's also true that there are differing opinions even within like the Kurdish diaspora, for example, about the significance of something like Rojava. And there are Kurdish folks that see it as essentially still as a nationalist project, or they would like to project those aspirations onto it. And so thinking about the idea of integrating into the Syrian state for folks that are seeing it through this lens is going to feel like a betrayal more than folks who are coming at it from the kind of ideological grounding that the movement there has and is leading from. And that is the paradigm of what they call a democratic nation. And so when the movement talks about democratic nation, this comes from writings of Abdullah Öcalan. This has been the movement's paradigm for the last 2 decades. And this has been, I mean, a lot of the people in the audience here are going to be familiar with this, but I think it's necessary grounding nonetheless, right? Moving from this idea that Kurdish freedom, Kurdish autonomy, Kurdish liberation would mean the establishment of an independent, separate Kurdish nation state, to this idea that for Kurdish communities to be liberated, all communities have to be liberated within their historic homeland, recognizing that that includes a plurality of people, but also going beyond that, that according to the kind of guiding philosophy of this movement, nation state structures themselves are an obstacle to real democratization. And so what they see themselves as doing is building democratic society kind of from the ground up through grassroots self-organization of civil society. And they see that as distinct from the political processes of states themselves, right? So Öcalan has these lines that like the fundamental contradiction is between the state and democracy. And the reason I'm bringing up this kind of like ideological jargon is I think it can actually help us understand like what's motivating the movement and how can we have some humility to understand that like there's a lot that's unclear about where things are going, but we don't really have any reason to believe that the movement has let go of these kind of foundational convictions. Because the other thing that defines this approach of democratic nation is the idea that if democracy is our goal, and if democracy is a self-organization of society, there's kind of two routes that this can happen. And they say option number one is to come to some kind of a compromise agreement with an existing nation state. that recognizes some bare minimum opening and political cultural rights for the people living kind of under its umbrella, so to speak, so that communities can organize themselves to achieve that real authentic democracy. But on the other hand, according to the movement, if some kind of compromise like that cannot be reached, that's where the movement and the communities that it represents have to take action to defend themselves and to kind of unilaterally implement their democratic vision. And I think historically we've seen this movement, if we can think of the movement not just through the lens zeroing in on Rojava only, but as like the larger sort of tree of the Kurdish freedom movement, you can see this movement that for the last 2 decades has been experimenting with the organization of society, trying to build authentic self-governance at the community level under a whole bunch of different conditions, right? So in Bakur in North Kurdistan, in the 2010s, right, there was a period of democratic opening in which the movement was building some of the first communes and councils and grassroots organizations at the community level happened before the Rojava Revolution, happened in southeastern Turkey. And what happened was the state violently repressed those structures, jailed local elected officials that were trying to use the opening of having local elections to make room for this kind of flourishing of democratic confederalism. And basically that opportunity closed to actually have that, what they call this compromise with the nation state in order to democratize society. In Rojava, you can kind of see things happening in the opposite direction, right? So Rojava is a place where the same movement, more or less, right, the same guiding philosophy encountered a civil war that was not of its making, created a bunch of chaos, and in a power vacuum that came from a weakened Assad regime, they had the opportunity to try to rapidly build in this opening democratic confederalism, but the situation has changed. So like in recent months, and even we could say maybe going back to, you know, October 7th, the events that led up to Israel's genocidal war against Gaza in the last couple of years, to, of course, what Clara described as the overthrow of the Assad regime, which surprised many of us, to even maybe including the re-election of Donald Trump. There's been all these upsets kind of concentrated in recent months. And I think one way we can think about it, try to understand what's going on, is that like the pre-existing sort of balance of forces that was in this stalemate just got like whacked with a hammer, and it's trying to reach an equilibrium again. And in unexpected ways, you know, previously entrenched states and movements have kind of been brought to the negotiating table. And so another big piece of news, going back a couple weeks to late February, is that Abdullah Öcalan, right, the founding leader, over 25 years in jail, imprisoned leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, released a statement. And this statement called on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, on the PKK, to disarm itself and dissolve itself. This was a huge piece of news, created a lot of controversy, a lot of uncertainty. It's important to understand that this statement was really, more than anything else, a call for democratic politics, just like we're talking about democratic nation, for this opening to reemerge yet again in Turkey, right? And there's a line of Öcalan's statement that was left out at the last minute, because of course the Turkish state kind of curates and controls anything that's taken out of the prison where Öcalan is being kept. And in this line, Öcalan set pretty clear criteria, saying obviously these steps will be impossible without like true recognition of democratic political rights of Kurdish people, right? So what did the PKK do in response to this statement? The PKK acknowledged it, said that the movement agrees with the statement of Öcalan, and immediately declared a unilateral ceasefire. In other words, without waiting for an agreement with the Turkish state to kind of show good faith that we want peace, the PKK called on all of its armed forces to immediately cease all offensive operations, right? So don't do anything unless fired upon by the Turkish state. And it also set, kind of outlined a set of conditions for moving forward with a process to discuss dissolving and disarming the party, which would require a party congress. And so what the PKK leadership said is we would need Turkey to cooperate in creating the necessary conditions for that process in the security sphere, which would mean you have to stop attacking us and bombing this region so that we can actually hold a Congress, we can convene leadership, we can discuss these questions. Otherwise, it just won't be feasible. Another condition was calling for the release of Öcalan, so that he could participate directly in those meetings, in the process to help lead these negotiations. And the third, I think, was reiterating something Öcalan himself brought up, which was in order to move this process forward, in order to have anything to discuss in the first place, there has to be the possibility for democratic politics and the participation of Kurdish communities in democratic politics within Turkey. And so the reason I bring all this stuff up is I think while on the one hand, it's important to understand that the SDF and the PKK are not the same thing, and that Öcalan's call on the party to disarm was not a call on the SDF to disarm, that Kurds in Syria have to make their own decisions autonomously. They are in a different set of conditions. And what's happening now with the understanding, the agreement that is being at least pursued with Damascus, is totally in line with this process happening in Turkey. But at the same time, I think it's important to see that they're related too, right? You can see that in this moment, after years and years of grinding war, in the case of Turkey and the Kurds of Bakur, there's been 4 decades of armed struggle and extreme state violence against Kurdish communities. In the case of Rojava, there's been, what, 13, 14 years of civil war. Kurdish communities are steadfast in their determination to defend themselves, but at the same time, the war has had devastating impacts on society. It makes the work of organizing civil society incredibly difficult. So I think we can understand, just to kind of try to wrap this up somehow, these things that are happening not as some sort of drastic break with the previous sort of like revolutionary aspirations of democratic autonomy or anything like that. What we're seeing is the desire to secure the gains that have already been had and to keep the door open to furthering the possibilities of this kind of bottom-up democratization of society by trying to put an end to these wars. And there will be lines in the sand, right? Both sides have acknowledged that, in other words, both sides of this border, right? So like the PKK and its relationship with the Turkish state, and the Syrian Democratic Forces in their evolving relationship with the new Syrian state, they both in their own ways are saying, we want peace. We hold true to our belief that our respective nation states should be democratized. And for us, that means decentralization. It means fundamental rights of women and of all ethnic communities. But we will make a good faith effort to pursue things further. So anyway, I think it probably makes a lot of sense there's so much that we've left unsaid and undiscussed, but it probably makes sense to move into questions, because I'm pretty confident people are going to bring up the stuff that matters.
Thank you both so much for that amazing update. And yeah, as you said, there's so much, it's such a complex situation and there's so much there. So encourage everyone to enter questions into the chat and we can put them to the panelists. And I can start it off with a question that I have, that, just I guess in general, how have the practices of democratic confederalism been seen in the areas, in the regions in Syria outside of SDF control, and in the kind of immediate fall of Assad? I had a moment, I was wondering whether this was a model that was going to be adopted outside of the kind of that area, and whether, so I guess, what's your sense of the way that this kind of political and ethical and social model is seen in Syria, and then in also Kurdistan and the region broadly?
I can
Put
take
that to
that
whoever.
briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can take that briefly and then hand over to Arthur. I think that, I mean, I mentioned this a little bit when I was speaking, but so the SDC, which is the sort of political coalition that has as its goal that of like introducing and offering this model to the Syrian people as a whole, has been making relationships with people around Syria for its whole existence, and they have had certainly some success in that way. I mean, there's like I said, the U.S. representation has an Alawite in the mix, and I think that one thing to keep in mind, like demographically, is that up until the fall of the regime, the situation was looking like, okay, I guess Bashar al-Assad, because of just sort of sheer unwillingness to stop being a dictator, won this war, and Russian and Iranian support. That was sort of the feeling, like, I guess this is a stalemate that has sort of been turned on its head in this sort of incredible way, but there was this stalemate. So he was there, but of course the international community was not okay with that. So there was massive sanctions on his region, etc. And so people were really suffering economically. The Syrian government salaries were incredibly low. And so there was a not insignificant wave of economic refugees, I can say, that were migrating to the Northeast, to the autonomous administration. And so there were many people just purely not out of like necessarily a desire to come because of their knowledge and they've learned about the autonomous administration and wanted to move there, but purely for economic reasons were coming to the Northeast. And in that process, they were experiencing this situation that was up there. And I noticed that there was a question in the chat about the agricultural co-ops and the land and stuff. And so I just wanted to briefly connect that question to this, but just that we noticed specifically with the agricultural co-ops and the land and people using the land in agricultural co-ops, that a lot of the people who were taking the biggest advantage of this opportunity that the autonomous administration was giving to the populace and making programs about were the IDPs, the internally displaced people, who were either displaced by Turkish violence or by violence in other parts of displaced from Idlib, where HTS was ruling, because there was a large percentage of the population who didn't want to live under a sort of extremist, semi-extremist government, and so was displaced from Idlib, made their way to the Northeast, and they were the population that, when I was there, when I was talking to people, the impression was that they were taking the biggest advantage of these opportunities. And so there was a large participation of people as they were making this internal migration. But there's also just a big sort of misunderstanding. I mean, Northeast Syria until this point was a very underdeveloped part of the country. I mean, Damascus and Aleppo and these cities are sort of ancient Silk Road, like, big cities. And so there was this just not in other parts of Syria, sometimes like not a very large focus necessarily on what was happening there is my impression. And of course, people had varying pathways through the sort of chaos of the Syrian civil war and how they came to their different political orientations. But there was this reality of interchange that was happening, and the SDC was doing their outreach, etc. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, if I could just tack on real quick, I think it's a really great question that I know I had conversations with I have conversations that I remember having with Arab people in Northeast Syria about how initially this whole democratic confederalism thing they saw as very much just like a Kurdish thing, and like, that's not for me. Like, I'm Arab, our community's Arab. Like, what's Öcalan got to do with me, you know? But through realizing that these structures seemed to be functioning well for Kurdish communities, and that seemed to be open to people, and then starting to like learn a little bit about the ideas behind them, they started to become inspired and supportive and start participating. But in a lot of ways, it's still a struggle. Like, anybody who's spent time in Rojava, who's being honest with you, would tell you that, you know, outside of Kurdish communities, it's a real mixed bag, the extent to which the local communities are really like wholeheartedly adopting these practices of like participatory community self-governance, right? It depends on kind of relationships. It depends on level of kind of political consciousness and commitments. I would say also like the movement has sort of like blossomed into different communities too. For example, the Future Syria Party is an organization in Syria that was founded, inspired by the ideas of the Kurdish freedom movement, but really taking ownership over it as people from like Arab communities and broader like Syrian communities. And I was fortunate to have conversations with members of the Future Syrian Party about that, and about the work they were trying to do to spread these ideas of democracy and develop like a language of their own, as they put it, for how to talk to their own communities about it. But the thing I really want to say is I have a funny story, which is that in my time in Sheba, I was finally given access through our driver, our fixer, to get out to a remote community that was experiencing attacks by Turkey and Turkish proxies. And we were going to go there, document what was happening, and report on it. But to get there, we had to go through regime-controlled territory, and then we had to go through a village that was basically Hezbollah-controlled village. And when this happened, the driver starts telling this story with the other person who's from Sheba and is kind of a co-chair of the local council in his village there. And he said, you know what? The funniest thing happened. One day, this representative from Hezbollah came and said, you know, we'd like to talk to you Kurdish people about this whole commune thing. What is it with these communes? You know, like we've had a lot of trouble with conflicts in the regions that we're governing, and we heard that like this seems to be functioning really, really practically for people on the ground. So would you be interested to like teach us how to build communes? And you know, the folks from the Kurdish movement, like they always do, they said, yeah, tamam, as they would say. And they had a conversation about it, and they realized as soon as they started describing how it actually works, that the Hezbollah representative said, wait, but how do you actually make sure that like the sheikh is the one actually making all the decisions, and that women aren't like participating? And the Kurdish guy was like, no, like it's actually democratic. People make decisions for themselves and everybody's welcome. And the whole thing fell apart. But I thought it was funny because there was some interest for cynical, practical reasons, that not because of the ideology, but just because things just kind of work well in these communities that are self-organized.
I would also jump in there just to add briefly, because you specifically asked about women, and then I didn't answer that about do women work on the agricultural cooperatives? Yeah, I mean, women like the IDPs that I was talking about who take advantage of these programs. Yeah, a lot of them are women, absolutely. And there is, though, also existing in Rojava still very much a working the agricultural land for wage work system, and also a lot of those people are women, but also men. So that is a work in progress. And then the other thing I would add just about how the communes and the ideas of democratic confederalism and organizing have sort of spread throughout the society is that the tribal system that already exists in both Kurdish and Arab communities has proven to be really interesting and fertile ground for these discussions of how community decision making happens, right? It's sort of an already existing part of the society, and how democratic confederalism as this kind of new idea has interacted with the existing systems of tribal reconciliation councils and stuff is a very fruitful and interesting place for discussions. And of course, those are mostly very patriarchal in nature. So one of the main innovations there, right? So certainly we saw this a lot in Malajin, so the Women's House, where women-led mediation centers about domestic violence, is that, you know, women are empowered to sort of sit in the sheikh's chair, so to speak, in places where they wouldn't have been before. And so there's the cultural understanding of what's happening, and then the innovations and how things are changing. So I would just add that.
Thanks. And I see two questions here kind of about some of the belligerent neighbors surrounding or neighboring Syria. One of them is Turkey. Like, how would kind of integrating, and I'm sure it's kind of hard to know at this point, but integrating, merging the military, how do they keep Turkey and HTS to uphold their side of agreements if they kind of integrate the material, and that other nation states would not be likely to step in? And I've kind of, from my own reading, been seeing that Turkey seems to be generally supportive of this recent agreement between SDF and HTS, but the HTS-led government. But I guess, how do you see this impacting the relationship between the northeast Syria and Turkey?
Well, I'd like to hear what Arthur has to say, but I will just say that the interesting thing about this deal is they did not say that they're going to hand over their weapons, right? That was the sticking point. And what's interesting about this deal, and it's why it's sort of like a deal to come, is that they didn't actually said that. That hasn't been agreed upon. And so that is very much an open question, and in fact one that might ultimately be resolved, so to speak, in SDF's favor. And yeah, open question.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think one way to understand all the things that are missing and sort of ambiguous about this this recent agreement that was published yesterday is to see it as partially a reflection of the reality of the talks, that there's just only so much that can be agreed on right now, and the rest have to be worked out in detail over the coming months. You know, the formal commitment was by the end of the year, I think, and even Saleh Muslim made a statement like today that maybe it would take a year total, right? So this is going to take a long, long time, and a lot of pushing and pulling could happen in the interim. But the other thing is that there's probably a degree of strategic ambiguity, intentional ambiguity on the part of all parties, right? I mean, one of the confusing things about trying to understand situations like this is if we zoom in and just look at like the text of the bullet points of this agreement and think that like that's the scope of what's on the table and what's going to happen or not happen in Syria, we really have a pretty like impoverished idea of a pretty limited understanding of what's even being negotiated. There's so many of the real details that are most important to different parties are not going to be in a written statement at this stage, and maybe even ever, right? But that even the statement itself, the kind of informal interview quotes that people are giving, tweets that are happening, all of these things, so many of them are actually a part of the negotiation. It's a part of this kind of spiraling political warfare that's happening as everybody tries to kind of jockey for position in this kind of post-fall of Assad, post-Assad kind of chaos, right? But let's not forget the strength that the SDF does have, right? The SDF taken as a bloc is the largest armed force in Syria, period, right? All the other armed forces are so fractured, they don't have that kind of size. We're talking about basically a third of Syrian territory that's currently under their control. They have something like 110,000 people under arms. And that doesn't even include the kind of very informal groups of volunteer neighbor kind of like grassroots defense groups that exist attached to every kind of village and neighborhood commune, right? So just because HTS has its own vision that it wants to impose on all of Syria, and just because it had the ability to militarily overthrow the regime, does not mean it actually has the strength to impose its vision and its control over all of Syria, right? So the movement is holding cards here. That being said, how does it impact Turkey? Some of the ambiguity makes it still uncertain, right? So like, what are going to be the terms? Initially, what Damascus was demanding was that the Kurds would just like, not just the Kurds, but the whole SDF would just lay down their arms and dissolve, period, right? And people would be integrated as like individuals, maybe, into the new Syrian army that would be under centralized command. The language of this agreement doesn't really do that. It talks about the SDF integrating, and that's different. And of course, behind the scenes, the movement is clearly pushing for integrating as a bloc, holding their local regional character, and all of these things. Turkey, for its part, the simplest way to think about it is that if the SDF is formally a part of the Syrian state, then anything Turkey does to attack them, to invade their territory, is literally an act of war against Syria. And that's just got a different political price tag than their attacks have had thus far, right? And so if they can get some kind of agreement, even just this initial tentative agreement, I think hopefully will be some sort of shield against Turkish escalation. That being said, like Turkey's attacks continue, right? Drone strikes, airstrikes. The same is true in the mountains of northern Iraq against the PKK. But in the long haul, it may have a real impact.
Thank you. And there's a question here about some of the kind of Israeli attacks following the immediate fall of Assad. But just to kind of follow up on a point you made there about how the SDF is the largest military organization in the country, when kind of HTS swept through and was able to kind of knock out Assad so quickly, was it the kind of Turkish-backed assaults on the SDF territory that prevented the SDF from kind of having, I guess, a greater kind of chance of making a national kind of impact? Was surprising to me how HTS was able to sweep along so much, and you even mentioned earlier that SDF lost territory. So that's kind of one question I'll put. I mean, that's probably a lot there, but there was another question about hearing about Israel's attack on the Syrian military capacity and the expansion of its occupation of the Golan Heights, and that's impact on the SDF in Rojava. And then we'll go back to internal questions about the internal issues in Syria.
I can take the first one briefly, which is there's a geographic reality here, actually. Like between the Northeast, there's and Damascus, there's the Badia Desert, which doesn't really have very many transportation. I mean, ISIS exists there. So also, we didn't even talk about this, right? Also, ISIS, right? ISIS still exists, and they took advantage of the chaos after December 8th to also regroup, and the SDF has been dealing with attacks that ISIS has been launching on their forces from mostly the regions that they are regrouping in the Badia Desert. So not that, ISIS is a strong enough force on its own. It's an insurgency, but it is a strong enough force to stop the SDF, in its full power from advancing across this piece of land. But there's also across that area, there's the US has another base, Al-Tanf, and at the time they work with these FSA. It's a whole other part that, because it's in the middle of the desert, often goes just kind of it's like a side story. But so there's a geographic issue I also think that there was, probably some negotiations and conversations with the US, who are their military partners, about, what the US was hoping that they do. I mean, not, and the SDF was making calculations in many different directions. And I wasn't there. I wasn't sure that those negotiations looked like, but the geographic problem is not small, right? Like it's moving forces to specifically Damascus from where they are, is a large logistical challenge, and has been, in terms of getting to the discontiguous parts of the autonomous administration control, like, for example, the neighborhoods in Aleppo, that the YPG controls, has been it has been an issue for a long time. So, and then given the speed that everything happened, and the ISIS fronts that were opening up also at the same time, and then also the Turkish, the SNA fronts that were happening at the same time, like, absolutely, as you alluded to, that would have put a stress on their resources. Yeah.
I would say also there's a political element to it, that just in oversimplified terms, the SDF's never been interested in overthrowing the central government and replacing the central government of Syria, right? Like, the whole scope of their mandate is to defend their own regions and their own communities. So that's continued to be their priority. But yeah, even if they wanted to, there would have been real, like, tactical and logistical constraints, like Clara said. The other thing is, like, they don't have air power, and Turkey, NATO's second largest military, was upping the ante of drone strikes and airstrikes right at that very moment. There were, interestingly enough, real gains on the ground that the SDF achieved. It's not as if they didn't try to, like, push their lines in that moment too. They gained some territory around Deir ez-Zor, which was in the regime hands across the river. They gained some territory in the Euphrates region, consolidating some of their forces. But ultimately, they had to pull back to the Euphrates because of Turkish air power supporting the SNA. Then there was the other question about Syria, about Israel and the Golan Heights, right? I mean, I don't have a very sophisticated answer, but I mean, we can think of Syria as yet another state outside of Syria. We can think of Israel, rather, excuse me, as yet another sort of, like, outside state just trying to pursue its own cynical interests and take advantage of any kind of chaos or opportunities, right? So as the regime falls, which, by the way, Israel and the US certainly have a degree of, like, not approval because of how it's weakened Iran's position and its relationship to Hezbollah through Syria, right? Iran had a very strong relationship bolstering the Assad regime. But nonetheless, Israel wants to have as much leverage as possible in relationship to its new neighboring state. And so pushing its forces across the border, seizing territory, even things like putting out sort of symbolic statements that, the rights of ethnic minorities like the Druze and, like, the Kurds should be respected. Do we interpret that as Israel genuinely caring about safeguarding minority communities? Absolutely not, right? But it furthers their interest in the short term to make statements like this, to carry out military operations like those in the Golan Heights. And it's really, just watch Game of Thrones. It's Game of Thrones. Chaos is a ladder. I mean, it's really what it is. It's just cynical, but it's like, to a state like Israel, it's just a game to see what they can get out of it.
Yeah. And on that kind of point about ethnic minorities, someone asked, given the recent massacres, how not that, I mean, it seems unclear exactly what the relationship of the perpetrators was to the HTS government, and going forward, how can people trust HTS led government to uphold their agreements? And do you know if they have any plans in place to protect these communities from further massacres?
Yeah, great question. Also, I think we're all very deeply concerned. So what's happening is not acceptable. That's why I think the deal that was made is interesting, because it's not what was sort of on the table and seemed untenable was this idea that the SDF would give up all their weapons, and then if people wanted to, as individuals, rejoin some sort of newly reconstituted Syrian army, they could do that, but the SDF wouldn't be allowed to remain as sort of units, right? That could protect communities, like their own communities, or that could incorporate, as the SDF has done to date, protection forces for ethnic minorities. But that the agreement that we've seen does not make that clear. It doesn't make clear that the SDF can't join as units. It just says that there's going to be an integration. And so what that will look like going forward, I don't think it's a question. It was a shocking agreement to see, but it doesn't actually, upon further reflection, give HTS much that they already hadn't sort of been willing to give in principle. And it leaves the door open for further discussion and further negotiation about what that integration is going to look like. And, there's a universe in which that looks like, ethnic minorities moving towards the model of SDF. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a part of these negotiations. I'm not the finer details will be hashed out, and we'll see we will get more information as this goes on. But the existing structure isn't necessarily sort of canceled out by the existing structure, meaning the sort of the ethic of the SDF, the structure that provides for the protection of ethnic minorities explicitly, isn't canceled out by this agreement. And so therefore it's not being left essentially in this way towards trusting HTS. What's being preserved is the idea of the territorial integrity of Syria. Whether that ends up looking more on the ground like a federal system or something like that is open to interpretation, and it's open to negotiation. And one thing I know that is very important for the SDF and for the autonomous administration in general, and would also be very important for the Druze or the Alawites, I can imagine, or the Armenian community, is that any local, no matter what this integration of the military force looks like, that moving forward, instead of having a system where the sort of military or security forces are, metastasized across the country, that the local police force would be more reflective of the local community. And that's definitely something that I would imagine would be very much a part of the negotiations that are going to now unfold, and is something that people are pushing for in different ways. So yeah, that's what I would say. And just to keep the focus on the violence that is currently happening in the absence of the protection that the SDF kind of provides across the country, and to think about hopefully the way that we can push for and advocate for the cessation of that violence, and then the construction ultimately of a Syrian army that prevents it going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the political leadership of the autonomous administration, Ilhan Ahmad, has been forcefully calling for the violence to be against the Alawite community to be stopped. Military leadership, right? General Muslim Abdi has been calling for the same thing. The position of the Syrian Democratic Council has always been for the decentralization of power in Syria, meaning all communities have the right not only to cultural autonomy, to political autonomy, and to autonomous control over their own self-defense forces. I think the announcement of the Sueda Military Council was very interesting in that it really reflected a similar kind of model and rhetoric as the Syrian Democratic Forces use, but rooted in the Druze community. There have been conversations for years, ongoing dialogue between Kurdish movement and other ethnic minorities in Syria. But lastly, at the end of the day, I think when it comes to the question of how in practice can these minority communities be truly protected, I think Rojava is nothing if not a lesson that like the only true safety and security available to communities is in their self-organization. They're at the cultural level, at the political level, at the military level in terms of self-defense. And so if other communities in Syria that are minority communities, non-Arab, non-Sunni Arab communities are going to have the same degree of leverage, we could say, that the SDF is holding right now in trying to consolidate its own gains, it's going to require that kind of organization, I think.
Thank you. So much more to cover, but we're kind of running, only have 13 more minutes, but a few kind of questions I'll combine here. There was kind of a question about the relationship of convenience the SDF has with the United States and how, you know, that's kind of been used to by some to kind of cynical lens of saying that, you know, it refers to them as kind of US collaborators or something. So how does this kind of shift that relationship, especially as the Trump administration has shown that it has pretty much no loyalty to the SDF forces, as was seen in the last administration? And I'm going to just list 3 questions here. The second question being the relationship of the Kurdish liberation movement, or the SDF in particular, to the Palestine liberation movement, and the kind of how this person is asking about SDF seemingly friendly talks with Israel. I'm not sure what that's specifically referring to, but if you know anything about that. And then the third question in this link is what you expect HCS government's relation to the Western imperialist powers will be kind of going forward. So that's 3 questions. Then we can see what time there is for some more. But yeah, thanks.
I'll briefly take the first one, and I kind of didn't quite get to write down the second one, so I'll pass over to Arthur and then pop in if I have anything to add. But as far as the, you know, insinuations of US collaboration, or these ways that people talk about what's going on in Northeast Syria, I guess just as like contextually, I would bring, you know, our attention back to the intensity of the battle in Kobani, right, in 2014, 2015, when, I mean, ISIS was sweeping across Iraq and Syria. It was extreme. The world was gripped by their incredibly successful terror propaganda campaign. And everyone failed to stop them. And in that process, they got lots of state weapons, and they were becoming more and more lethal and more scary. And in the face of that, you know, this group of Kurds and others who are supporting them, you know, Arab people, this group of people in Northeast Syria, and Kurds from all parts of Kurdistan were there and stood up to them with extreme bravery. That, I mean, the Battle of Kobani, I think, you know, hopefully in military history will sort of go down as one of these like studied and important moments. And the United States saw that and decided to support them with airstrikes. And then ISIS saw their first defeat, and after that never had another major military victory because of the bravery that people had. And so then for people to sort of use that to sort of intellectually punish people, to me, is very unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate like place to end up, right? Of course it's complex. Of course there's a, you know, but the heart of the thing is that, to me, is that moment that happened in Kobani, and the sort of bravery that turned the tide against this thing that was gripping the world. So there's that. Now, of course, the US has been there ever since. that has meant a lot of different things. And it's very, we could talk endlessly about what that relationship has looked like, how it then evolved. Because at the time, the SDF wasn't, they were, it was the YPG and the YPJ, and then other militias, which had decided to fight with them as well. So it wasn't just the Kurds. And that relationship has evolved, and we can talk about that now. But it's been clear for a while. Certainly, Trump had his decision to pull out troops that then kind of got reversed and was a little confusing, but led to the Turkish invasion of Syria. But they wanted to leave for quite some time. So, and they've been making plans and thinking about, okay, how do we do this in a sustainable way? Of course, we don't want to be there forever. Et cetera, et cetera. And they've been making plans and sort of negotiating. And one way to look at what's happened here is, maybe the US will think, okay, we can now leave more. But the other thing I would just mention is that Trump, in speeches that he's been giving, and because he sort of gives often comments now just straight from the Oval Office, and in the past few days he's been mentioning, at the same time he's been mentioning siding with Russia in the war against Ukraine. He's also been angling towards more of a sort of heating up of the conflict with Iran. And so US presence in Syria, because it's not just in the Northeast and the Autonomous Administration, there's also a presence in Al-Tanf in the Badia Desert along the border, is would be a factor in any military engagement that they got into with Iran. And so I think we also need to look at it in that, from that perspective, and to see, what ends up being the priorities of the administration, and what role Syria will play in whatever it is that they're trying to do. But that, of course, the goal of the SDF and the goal of the Syrian people and the autonomous administration is certainly not to be drawn into another sort of proxy war with Iran or Iranian forces. And because what's happened in Syria now is this is sort of a blow to Iran. And so off to you, Arthur.
No, that's great. It's not great, but your description is great. I think, just to add, when it comes to kind of wrestling with the SDF accepting support or having some relationship to outside nation states that sort of contradict its own political values, it's not, I don't think it should be taken as very surprising or strange or contradictory. But when this comes up, I usually like to share this quote from Muslim Abdi, right, the general commander of the SDF. And this quote comes from him being asked how the SDF could tolerate the return of some of the regime forces to the northern border back in 2018, when the movement was facing a Turkish invasion. And he had this one-liner. He just said, if faced with a choice between compromise and genocide, we'll choose our people every time. And I think that just says it all, right? It's not a choice. It's a question of literal survival or extermination when faced with the full force of something like ISIS or Turkey, when having no allies whatsoever. Nobody can survive that. So it's easy for sort of, I don't know, to put it less patiently, armchair revolutionary anti-imperialists on the other side of the world to say, oh, well, that kind of contradicts something. The movement's very honest and, interestingly enough, about its own positions. If you can see very explicit statements from say the leadership of the KCK, the Kurdistan Communities Union, which is sort of this umbrella of the Kurdish freedom movement, which includes but is far beyond the SDF, or rather YPG, YPJ. And they've said very clearly that, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, that the United States is an imperialist power that is like largely responsible for the rise of groups like ISIS in the first place and is pursuing its own cynical interests. But when you zoom in to a particular community in a particular place in time, like Kurds in Syria facing ISIS in Kobani, or in a very difficult position today of trying to figure out how to protect their communities and consolidate their gains. They have to make hard choices, and their public statements aren't necessarily going to represent the full spectrum of their revolutionary aspirations, right? So like, for example, there's been not really a controversy, but it's been like a Twitter conversation, right? Because over the Israelis saying something like Kurdish rights should be recognized, and then Muslim Abdi being asked about it, like, do you accept this support? And I think he said something like, yeah, we accept the support. We appreciate support from anybody who wants to like support our continued existence and protect our rights, whatever. And I think people would get the same exact quote if it was China making a statement, if it was the United States making a statement, if it was Russia. They're just protecting their own communities. And they don't really have the privilege of making elaborate ideological statements and denying that kind of support when it's life or death. If there was another question, I missed it.
There were, yeah, I was asking about the, or there was a question about the relation of the SDF to the Palestine Liberation Movement and what the kind of orientation the HTS-led government might have towards Western imperialist powers as it kind of solidifies itself.
You want to start, Clara? No, she says. Yeah, so I'm not aware of any, I don't think there is any kind of formal relationship between the SDF and the Israeli state. I don't think there's any formal relationship between the SDF and the Palestinians, but at a grassroots level and at a larger level of like the Kurdish freedom movement itself, there's a strong historical relationship between the Kurdish freedom movement and the more secular revolutionary wings of the Palestinian liberation movement, right? So for those who don't know, before the PKK launched the first like fights of the armed struggle in Turkey, they were training in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon with the DFLP, a Palestinian liberation group. In fact, like several PKK members were killed fighting Israel when Israel invaded Lebanon in, I think it's 82. Forgive me if I've got the year wrong. So there's a long legacy, and it continues today of dialogue and solidarity between like peoples. But both of these movements have evolved and expanded and fractured in different ways too. So there's not like a monolithic answer. I think that what we see in official terms as far as like a relationship right now on the surface is really just reflective of like geopolitical emergencies and like official diplomacy for like survival. But when you're on the ground in a place like Rojava, when you're in Kurdistan and you're living with, you're talking to people in the movement, it's all discussed as like an internationalist revolutionary movement. And in that way, people talk all the time about solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, just like other international struggles.
Thanks. We're at time. There's a few more questions. I don't know if you want to put, I guess I'll just ask the last two questions and we can end it with that. The first one is about the women's center structures throughout Syria and how that has been how this has been received either by Damascus central government or by local groups throughout the rest of Syria. And then the other question is about if you know anything about the Trump administration's positions on this deal and HTS's position on the U.S. presence in Syria. So we'll wrap with those two questions. And thank you all for coming out. I'm going to drop the new ISC course in the chat as well, so y'all can check that out.
So for the women's structures, which somebody, I think people have mentioned the Malajin, which is the Kurdish phrase, which means women's house, which is the broad part of the, just for people who aren't aware, for whom that's a new term, just explain as the justice system, part of the justice system in which women-led sorry about that. Women-led mediation centers, essentially, which deal with things like domestic violence, mediations about potential honor killings, things like this. It took a while to gain the trust of the population, but it's been very successful, not only in the Kurdish majority regions, but also in the newly incorporated regions such as Raqqa and Tabqa, and Deir ez-Zor as well as certain pockets of the experiment. I believe in Damascus, certainly in Aleppo, and so that has been a real success and a very interesting and fruitful part of what's happening in Northeast Syria and the autonomous administration, because it's a great example of the personal and deep interpersonal work that it takes to change, to make social change in a way that is sustainable, accepted by the population, and culturally responsive to the reality of the situation, and the sort of day in and day out work that takes. And I spent a lot of time in the Malajin structures, and saw the approach to speaking with male family members or female family members who had sort of radical ideas about punishment or vengeance for violations of shame and honor, and watching these relationships and these views shift, and so that's the real sort of personal level of the revolution that leads to changes in people's day-to-day lives and in their families. So it's a very exciting and wonderful part of the women's revolution that has happened in the Northeast. And it's just one part of the women's, how women's autonomy and women's decision-making is built into the autonomous administration as a whole. The Malajin, one thing they do is to help enforce and educate, mostly like educate the public about, but then also enforce through their recommendations to the court system, which has to have tends to have like three justices, one of which has to be a woman, and also through the autonomous all women's police forces, laws that were created by all women's consultation across Northeast Syria that have been updated to accommodate other women coming into the experiment and the project. That was called the Women's Law at first when it was first made, but to reflect the fact that all human beings are involved in as they've learned throughout the evolution of the project, that all human beings are involved in this personal work of making our relationships with each other more just, and like sometimes it's the woman's fault, for example, that something is happening, or sometimes the problem lies with this person. They changed the name actually to the family law in the most recent iteration. So that's an example of how how the revolutionary structures and how the autonomous administration sort of responds to what they're learning on the ground, to be responsive and honest about what is going on. Okay, so that's what Malajin is. It's really great. It's very exciting. There's many different parts of the women's structures in the autonomous administration. I am not aware, to answer the question unsatisfactorily, I am not really aware of how that is being incorporated into any discussions. One thing about the women's movement is that, and this is how it was able to sort of get started at the beginning, is sometimes women go under the radar. And until they're not under the radar, certainly, it's not like women can do things without retribution, but I don't know how those negotiations are going on or what the future will look like of this institution. What I can say is it's very, very well established within the social structures and justice structures of the autonomous administration, certainly, and the maybe more underground experiments that are in different parts of the parts of Syria. And so, and because there is zero, there's zero decision about or explanation about how the civil institutions are going to be integrated into the rest of the Syrian government. It is an open question about what the future of these institutions looks like. And so that's something that we can be watching and strategically thinking about, what makes sense and advocating for. There is female representation in, I mean, we didn't even talk about the sort of Constitution Committee, the different things that are happening in Damascus in terms of pan-Syrian dialogue, which hasn't to date officially included the SDC or the Autonomous Administration, but now post this agreement might in a more real way. So we will see, but that is sort of hard to parse, not being on the ground. And I think it would also be hard to parse, like it just hasn't been publicly really talked about in any meaningful way that I've seen. So that's an open question, but hopefully in a positive sense, because of the work that's been done that makes it now sort of a real institution in people's minds and hearts, to some extent, and expectations, importantly, about what their government will provide for them, specifically women, but also men, right? It's been helpful to all members of society to have a place to go to work out these deeply personal and important parts of life in a just way that treats people with respect. So that's now an expectation that people have, and hopefully that expectation will carry over into, a demand for continued governance in this way. Yeah, I don't know what the second question was, but I'll let you dig it.
Yeah, I think just to expand on that, as far as Trump's position, what is the Trump administration going to do, right? Like the default America First move would be to cut and run. Let's get out of there. What do we have to do with Syria? That's been like the campaign pitch, right? But Trump is unpredictable. Like Clara said, the US could maintain a presence there longer than it has been signaling to counter Iran. It also could try to pursue some business deals with Damascus and HTS. Like none of that should shock us if it happens. But I think we just can't predict it now. We'll have to see kind of how it shakes out. But there is a general sense that part of the motivation to get this preliminary agreement signed, motivation from the SDF, but also motivation from the US to like encourage them to do it, and facilitate it, right? Like Muslim Abdi was flown to Damascus on a Chinook helicopter, was this idea that like, okay, US troops may not be there for very long and you should wrap this up and move this to the next chapter, right? That's the US, for its own cynical reasons, pushing that line. HDS's stance, I mean, ideologically, this Jelani was an Al-Qaeda leader, right? Like we should have no illusions about their ideology. They are deeply, deeply, misogynistic, fascistic movement, but they have really gone through all these phases of sort of like quote unquote reform, and maybe rebranding is a better way to put it. But Jelani, right, Shara has like also demonstrated like very savvy political skills too, right? Of just being a strategist. And so he also may go against the sort of like hardline ideological wing of his own organization to kind of make some clever strategic deals to look the other way and maintain a US presence or keep things amicable enough to get something out of it. But just to kind of like, I don't know, wrap things up with the bigger picture, I think the way that this all shakes out is going to depend on so much more than just like the written content of these agreements, not just the preliminary version, right? But however this all shakes out, whatever the final agreement is, maybe 12 months from now, is not likely to include all of the aspirations of the movement. And if and when that time comes, that is not going to even then be a sign that the movement has given up on those aspirations, right? The conditions are changing, but the commitments of this movement, the determination to use like the full force of its organization, of its ideas, of its legitimacy and support in society is going to be channeled into building what Öcalan calls a democratic nation. And that means that what could maybe happen is that if the best the movement can get on paper is an agreement that the political structures that are maybe traditional nation state structures that will exist elsewhere, like there's a central government, maybe there's a parliament, maybe there's some kind of regional heads of government, and there's some local forms of government, and there are elections to those positions. Maybe the best that the movement's going to get on paper is that Kurdish people in Kurdish regions can run in those elections and maybe get elected to those positions. That doesn't mean that the future of governance in Northeast Syria will be reduced to that just because that may be the only thing on paper. If that's the case, I think what we should expect actually is for all these rich grassroots structures in civil society, things like the neighborhood communes and the village councils and the Malajin, the women's houses, all of these structures to continue in a grassroots form no matter what, and to basically move into maybe a dual power phase where society itself is being organized to push self-governance as far as possible in line with the ideas of the movement. But through this agreement to end the war, there's some sort of bare minimum conditions, right? Like we're talking about these ideas that the movement's been discussing for 2 decades. Maybe these bare minimum conditions will be met so that it doesn't require a war to get that people will run for office, and then there will be this kind of bottom-up organizing as well. And I don't know, I'm not making predictions, but we need not despair in what's reduced to a piece of paper. The movement is still there, it still believes in the same things, and let's see what happens, and let's show our support. And so on that note, if people are interested not just in learning more about Rojava and the Kurdish freedom movement, but want to find ways to show their support, to participate in like grassroots advocacy for communities there, please encourage you, if you're not already familiar with ECR, to hit us up, contact us, get involved. Again, you can go to defendrojava.org. You can follow us on social media at defendrojava. You can email us at info@defendrojava.org. But please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions about the ways to get involved, let us know, because we do things like education, but we also do things like try to channel at key moments energy into, like, yes, dare I say, things like making phone calls to elected officials when there's a key decision that's going to be made, like whether or not to send weapons to Turkey or support a particular peace agreement. And as compromising or maybe not less than revolutionary as that may seem, it can be really important, and the communities there are asking for any support they can get from folks internationally. So hit us up. Let's just think of this as a conversation that's ongoing, and reach out to us there. And thanks so much to the ISE for like holding this space. Really appreciate it, for organizing all the logistics for this event and inviting all of your people. I really hope that we can have more kind of cross conversations in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I would just add to what he said beautifully, is that the Trump administration has made it clear through a statement from Marco Rubio that they support the deal. And there are many members of the autonomous administration who there are many members of the US government who are now newly in their positions, who have, as someone said in the chat, expressed support for the SDF in the past. And so many of the people in key sort of advising, I'm not going to say decision making because ultimately it falls to Trump, but key advising positions in the Trump administration have a long history of respect for, voiced and vocal respect for, and appreciation for the SDF. So we will see what that looks like. And then there was also another comment in the chat, which I think is a really good point, that I would offer an end to a a comment on, which is that yes, what has happened internally in the autonomous administration is a process of compromise and evolution, and sort of, as I was saying before, that reflects that we should take both as like as an expectation of something that would happen in a democratic project, and also as encouragement that it is happening in a way that's so visible and easy to track, how things have evolved and changed. And the social contract process happened 2014, 2016, 4 times at varying levels for maybe more 4 times at varying levels, like throughout the autonomous administration's process, which evolved and incorporated new communities. And so this question of what a democratic project looks like and how things are playing out on the ground are lessons that ultimately lead to like new expectations in the community for what's possible for the community. And that's what we're seeing really strongly in the autonomous administration in Rojava. That's what we've seen, and that's what we continue to see. So I thought that was a really good point in the chat. So I wanted to raise that up. And yeah, thank you so much for having us, and thank you everybody for joining. It's really it's great to see everybody here, and we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and think about what's happening in Rojava. It's really exciting for all of us, I think.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to thank you all for joining us tonight, and going to say peace and good night. Yeah.
Solidarity, y'all.
Bye.